Welcome back to another peaceful journey through history's less glamorous corners. Tonight, we're settling in for a long, meandering exploration of something that Hollywood has made look rather appealing: the life of a samurai. So find your most comfortable position, perhaps adjust that pillow one more time, and let your breathing slow as we prepare to discover why being a legendary warrior wasn't quite the honor-filled adventure you might imagine. Before we begin our gentle descent into medieval Japan, I'd love it if you could take just a moment to hit that subscribe button. It really helps our little corner of the internet grow. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and what part of the world you're listening from. There's something wonderfully soothing about knowing we're all drifting through history together, scattered across different time zones but united in our quest for restful knowledge. Picture yourself stepping through morning mist into a world where honor meant everything and personal comfort meant very little. Where the cherry blossoms that poets celebrated also marked the brief, precarious nature of life itself. Tonight, we'll walk slowly through the rice paddies and castle grounds of feudal Japan, exploring not the dramatic sword fights and noble deaths, but the quiet desperation of daily existence for those bound by an impossible code. The samurai, those legendary warriors who have captured imaginations for centuries, lived lives of such rigid structure and constant anxiety that even their moments of peace carried the weight of potential dishonor. Imagine spending every waking moment knowing that a single misstep could require you to end your own life, that your worth was measured not by happiness or fulfillment, but by your willingness to die well. As we settle into this exploration together, let your mind prepare for a journey through the mundane hardships that made up the real samurai experience. We'll discover how these men, and occasionally women, navigated a world where personal desires came last, where comfort was seen as weakness, and where the very concept of retirement was not just foreign, but shameful. So close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our quiet walk through the less celebrated corridors of samurai life, where the weight of expectation was heavier than any armor. Imagine being born into a world where your first breath commits you to a lifetime of potential suicide. This was the reality for anyone unfortunate enough to emerge from the womb of a samurai family. Unlike the romantic notion of choosing one's destiny, samurai children had their fate sealed before they could even focus their eyes properly. Picture a newborn in a traditional Japanese home, sliding doors filtering the soft light of dawn. The child's first cries echo off paper walls, and already, before the umbilical cord has even been cut, expectations begin to settle like invisible weights across tiny shoulders. The parents don't coo with simple joy at their healthy child. Instead, they're already calculating which sensei will begin the rigorous training, which weapons the child will need to master, and how many years they have before their offspring must be ready to die gracefully for their lord. The weight of Bushido, the way of the warrior, pressed down on these children with the persistence of humidity in summer. Every game they played, every story they heard, every interaction with adults reinforced the same suffocating message. Your life belongs to someone else, and your value lies in how willingly you'll surrender it. For samurai children, there was no clear distinction between childhood and military preparation. While other children might play with simple wooden toys, young samurai handled miniature weapons that were precise replicas of the tools they'd eventually use to kill or be killed with. Imagine tiny hands, still chubby with baby fat, learning to grip a small wooden sword with the same seriousness that other children might reserve for their favorite doll or toy horse. The games they played weren't games at all. Really, they were rehearsals for death. Picture a 5-year-old learning to sit in perfect Seiza position for hours, his legs gradually going numb as he practices the meditation that might, years later, prepare him for ritual suicide. The child's natural fidgeting is met not with patient understanding, but with sharp corrections that remind him that discipline begins now, and comfort ends now. Training began before dawn, when the air was still cool and heavy with dew. You can almost feel the chill seeping through thin clothing as young boys, some barely old enough to walk steadily, were roused from their sleeping mats to begin endless repetitions of basic movements. The wooden floors of the training halls, polished smooth by countless feet, echoed with the sound of small bodies learning to move with deadly precision. From the earliest age, samurai children lived under constant observation. Every gesture was evaluated, every expression analyzed for signs of weakness or improper thought. Imagine never having a moment, not even in sleep, when you could simply be a child, curious and carefree, and allowed to make mistakes without those mistakes being catalogued as character flaws that needed immediate correction. Teachers watched for signs of natural compassion, which needed to be carefully managed so it wouldn't interfere with the ability to kill efficiently. A child who showed too much distress at the sight of an injured animal might find himself subjected to additional exercises designed to build emotional callousness. Picture a sensitive young boy being forced to watch the butchering of farm animals, not out of cruelty, but out of a sincere belief that softness would eventually kill him. The psychological pressure was relentless in its gentleness. Rather than harsh punishment, children faced the far more devastating weapon of disappointment. A slight shake of the head from a respected teacher, a pause before acknowledging a child's presence, the subtle suggestion that perhaps this particular child might not have what it takes to honor his family name. These quiet forms of correction shaped young minds with surgical precision. Sleep itself became another form of training. Children learned to wake instantly at the slightest sound, to assess their surroundings immediately upon opening their eyes, to be perpetually ready for attack even in the supposed safety of their family homes. Rest was never complete rest. Even in dreams, they practiced dying well. Pain was not something to be avoided or minimized. It was a teacher to be welcomed and studied. Samurai children learned to categorize different types of discomfort, to breathe through increasing levels of hurt, and to maintain perfect composure even when their bodies screamed for relief. Picture the training exercises designed specifically to build pain tolerance. Young boys kneeling on rough stones for hours, learning to keep their faces serene even as their knees developed raw sores that would leave permanent scars. The point wasn't sadism, it was preparation for a world where showing pain could mean death, not just for the individual, but potentially for everyone depending on his strength. The winter training was particularly memorable. Imagine children standing waist-deep in freezing ponds, learning to control their breathing as ice formed in their hair. Their teachers watched carefully, not for signs that a child had reached his limit, but for any indication that he might surrender to the cold's demands before absolutely necessary. Pushing past the point where most people would stop wasn't unusual. It was the minimum acceptable standard. Fasting became another regular part of education. Not the spiritual fasting of monks seeking enlightenment, but the practical fasting of warriors who needed to know they could function effectively even when their bodies were desperate for nourishment. Children learned to ignore the gnawing sensation of hunger, to push through the weakness that came with days of minimal food, all while maintaining the perfect posture and alert attention that their station demanded. Every action carried the weight of generations of family honor. Children grew up surrounded by stories of ancestors who had died gloriously, who had chosen death over dishonor, who had demonstrated the kind of unwavering loyalty that the current generation was expected to match or exceed. Imagine living in a house where the walls seemed to whisper constant reminders of your inadequacy. Family shrines held mementos of warriors who had achieved the kind of perfect death that you, as a living child, could never match. Every ancestor's story was simultaneously an inspiration and an impossible standard, a reminder that your value would ultimately be measured by your willingness to throw away everything you've been trained to preserve. The psychological architecture of samurai childhood was designed to produce individuals who could function efficiently in impossible situations, who could make life-or-death decisions without the luxury of time or complete information, and who could face their own mortality with a kind of composure that would inspire others to follow their example. But this training came at the cost of almost everything we might recognize as childhood joy. Spontaneity was dangerous, emotional expression was weakness, and personal desire was a luxury that could get everyone killed. These children grew up to be extraordinarily effective warriors, but the price they paid in simple human happiness was staggering. As we transition from these early years of conditioning, imagine the weight that settled permanently across the shoulders of young samurai as they moved from childhood training into the even more demanding world of adult service. The foundation of pain tolerance, emotional suppression, and absolute obedience was now complete, ready to support a lifetime of service that would test every lesson they'd learned in these formative years. Picture awakening before the first bird begins its song, when the world exists in that peculiar gray space between night and dawn. For a samurai, this wasn't the gentle emergence from sleep that most of us know, but an instant transformation from unconsciousness to complete alertness. There was no luxury of stretching, no moment of peaceful confusion about where you were or what day it was. Consciousness arrived like a sword stroke, immediate, sharp, and demanding action. The morning preparations followed a rhythm as precise as any ceremony, but without ceremony's inherent beauty. Imagine the methodical process of dressing in layers of clothing designed more for tradition than comfort. The hakama trousers, perfectly pleated and impossibly wide, weren't meant for ease of movement but for the proper appearance of dignity. Each fold had to fall exactly right, each tie secured with the kind of precision that suggested your attention to detail extended to every aspect of your existence. The weight of the swords, both katana and wakizashi, settled across the hip like familiar companions, but companions whose presence served as constant reminders of mortality. Every morning, you strapped on the tools of your own potential destruction, weapons that could end your life as easily as they could save it. The scabbards, polished to mirror brightness, reflected not just light but the faces of everyone who might judge your worthiness to carry such implements. Before the household stirred properly awake, before servants began their daily tasks, the samurai had already spent an hour in meditation. Not the peaceful, restorative meditation of monks, but a focused preparation for death that required confronting, every single day, the reality that this might be your last sunrise. Imagine sitting in perfect stillness while your mind methodically reviewed every possible way you might fail your lord, your family, or yourself in the hours ahead. Service to one's daimyo wasn't the romantic ideal of loyal friendship between equals that popular culture often suggests. Instead, it was a grinding performance of perfect subservience that required the complete erasure of personal will. Picture standing for hours in elegant halls, your posture flawless, your expression carefully neutral, while your lord conducted business that might not concern you at all but which you were required to witness with the appearance of complete engagement. The physical demands of constant readiness were exhausting in ways that modern life rarely requires. Imagine maintaining perfect posture from dawn until well past sunset, never allowing your shoulders to sag or your attention to visibly wander, even when your feet had gone numb from standing and your back ached from the weight of your armor and weapons. The slightest sign of fatigue could be interpreted as disrespect, and disrespect could demand a response that ended with your death. Court life involved an intricate dance of protocol where every gesture carried meaning, every glance could be interpreted as communication, and every silence might indicate either proper respect or dangerous inattention. Samurai learned to read the micro-expressions of their superiors with the intensity of scholars studying sacred texts, because misunderstanding a subtle shift in mood could lead to consequences far beyond simple embarrassment. The boredom was perhaps the most unexpected aspect of this supposedly glamorous life. Hours upon hours of standing attendance while administrative details were discussed, while poetry was recited, while tea was served with elaborate ceremony that valued form over function. Picture the mental effort required to appear fascinated by the 70th discussion of rice distribution or the endless subtle variations in seasonal poetry that your lord found delightful, but which made your mind feel like it was slowly drowning in elegant irrelevance. Money, or rather, the chronic lack of it, shaped samurai life in ways that the warrior code preferred not to acknowledge. While merchants grew wealthy through trade, while farmers at least owned their rice crops, samurai depended entirely on stipends from their lords, payments that could be delayed, reduced, or eliminated entirely based on political circumstances beyond their control. Imagine the peculiar humiliation of being a professional warrior who couldn't afford to properly maintain your weapons, whose armor showed signs of careful mending that everyone pretended not to notice, whose family ate rice mixed with cheaper grains while maintaining the appearance of prosperity that your social status demanded. The Bushido Code insisted that money concerns were beneath the attention of noble warriors, but unpaid bills have a way of demanding attention regardless of philosophical ideals. The economic pressure created a constant background anxiety that had to be hidden behind the mask of serene confidence that samurai were expected to wear at all times. Picture trying to project the calm assurance of someone who could face death without flinching while privately calculating whether you could afford to replace your sandals before they fell apart completely, whether your family could manage another month with reduced rations, whether the merchant who supplied your household goods would continue extending credit to someone whose income depended entirely on the goodwill of a lord who might decide at any moment that your services were no longer required. Being a samurai meant living as a public symbol rather than as a private individual. Every action, every word, every expression was subject to interpretation by others who were measuring your performance against an impossible standard of perfect warrior nobility. Imagine never having a moment when you could simply be tired, or confused, or uncertain without those natural human states being interpreted as character flaws that might require correction through exile or death. The pressure extended to your family as well. Your wife had to embody the ideal of samurai femininity, strong enough to commit suicide gracefully if honor required it, but also capable of managing a household on whatever resources you could provide. Your children were watched for signs of the warrior spirit that would justify the family's continued existence. Even your servants reflected on your status. Their appearance and behavior became extensions of your own reputation. Social interactions required the kind of constant vigilance that most people associate with dangerous situations. A casual conversation could contain tests of loyalty, veiled challenges to your courage, or subtle insults that required precise responses to maintain face without escalating to violence. Picture the exhaustion of spending every social moment analyzing subtext, choosing words with the precision of a diplomat, and maintaining the appearance of relaxed confidence while internally mapping every possible way the conversation could go wrong. The clothes you wore, the way you walked, the tone of your voice when greeting different ranks of people. All of these became components of an elaborate performance that never ended. Sleep was the only escape from the necessity of being perfectly samurai-like, and even dreams often featured scenarios where you failed to meet the standards that waking life demanded. The higher a samurai rose in rank and reputation, the more isolated he became from anything resembling normal human connection. Excellence in the warrior arts meant becoming someone who could kill efficiently and die beautifully, qualities that didn't necessarily translate into the kinds of relationships that provide emotional sustenance for ordinary people. Picture the loneliness of being someone whose primary value to others lay in your willingness to die for them. Friendships became complicated by questions of rank and loyalty. Love relationships had to navigate the reality that honor might require abandoning or even killing those you cared about most. Even conversations with family members carried the underlying knowledge that your code might someday demand choices that would destroy everything you personally treasured. The pursuit of martial perfection created a kind of existential loneliness that was difficult to share with anyone who hadn't walked the same path. How do you explain to someone that you've spent years training to kill people with the same dedication that artists bring to creating beauty? How do you describe the specific kind of anxiety that comes from knowing that your reputation depends on your willingness to seek out situations where violent death is likely? As we move deeper into this exploration of samurai existence, imagine how these daily pressures and contradictions built up over years, creating lives of extraordinary discipline and equally extraordinary psychological strain. The foundation of childhood training now supported a structure of adult service that demanded everything while promising only the opportunity to die well. When we think of samurai warfare, our minds conjure images of elegant single combat, honorable duels between worthy opponents, and deaths so beautiful they could inspire poetry. The reality was considerably more mundane and infinitely more horrifying. Picture instead the chaos of actual medieval combat. Not the choreographed dance of Hollywood films, but the desperate scrambling of frightened men trying to kill each other with sharpened metal while slipping in mud mixed with blood and worse things. The famous katana, that symbol of samurai nobility, was actually a backup weapon. In real combat, samurai relied primarily on long spears called yari, bows and arrows, and eventually firearms. The sword was what you used when everything else had failed, when the battle had devolved into the kind of close-quarters desperation where technique mattered less than luck and the ability to keep functioning while covered in other people's blood. Imagine the sensory assault of an actual battlefield. Not the clean clash of steel that movies suggest, but the overwhelming stench of human waste released by terror and death, the screaming that wasn't dramatic last words but the raw animal sounds of people discovering what their bodies looked like on the inside. The weight of armor that seemed manageable during training became crushing after hours of fighting, and the careful meditation practices that prepared samurai for death proved inadequate preparation for the specific horror of watching friends die slowly and messily just a few feet away. The romantic notion of facing death with serene acceptance crumbled quickly when confronted with the reality that most battlefield deaths weren't quick or clean. Picture lying in mud with a spear wound in your gut, knowing you have hours left to live, hours to spend contemplating not the philosophical beauty of impermanence but the specific, boring details of how much this hurts and how desperately you want to see your family one more time. Samurai warfare wasn't driven by the noble ideals that the warrior code celebrated, but by the same petty political calculations that motivate most human conflict. Lords fought over tax revenues, trade routes, and marriage alliances, using their samurai the way farmers use tools, efficiently and with minimal concern for the tool's own preferences or well-being. The loyalty that samurai were taught to value above their own lives often meant nothing more than being an expensive weapon in someone else's attempt to become slightly more wealthy or powerful. Picture spending years perfecting your martial skills, developing the kind of character that could face death without flinching, only to discover that your lord wants you to die in order to settle a dispute over rice distribution rights or to support his son-in-law's claim to a minor administrative position. The switching of loyalties was common enough to have its own terminology, but this practical reality conflicted sharply with the idealistic notion of unwavering devotion that Bushido demanded. Imagine the psychological strain of serving a lord who had betrayed his previous allies, knowing that your own absolute loyalty was being given to someone whose own loyalty was purely situational. You were expected to die for someone who would abandon you without hesitation if political circumstances made it advantageous. War crimes were routine and expected. Civilians were killed not just as collateral damage but as deliberate strategy. Villages were burned not because they posed military threats, but because destroying them weakened enemy morale and demonstrated the consequences of supporting the wrong side. Picture having to maintain your sense of personal honor while participating in actions that any reasonable moral framework would condemn as monstrous. The Bushido Code emphasized the spiritual aspects of combat, the way that facing death could lead to enlightenment, the beauty that could be found in the perfect execution of martial techniques. What it didn't prepare samurai for was the specific psychological reality of killing other human beings, particularly when those human beings turned out to be terrified teenagers or reluctant farmers conscripted into service. Imagine the first time you killed someone in combat. Not the noble warrior of equal skill that you'd trained to face, but a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, whose last words were calling for his mother. The philosophical framework that made such actions theoretically acceptable proved inadequate when confronted with the reality of watching the light fade from someone's eyes, knowing that your skill and training had just eliminated another person's entire future. The repetition of killing wore down even the most carefully constructed mental defenses. Picture what it did to your sleep, your appetite, your ability to enjoy simple pleasures, when your days were filled with the routine work of ending lives. The meditation practices that were supposed to prepare you for death provided little guidance for processing the accumulated weight of all the deaths you had caused. Some samurai dealt with this psychological burden by developing a kind of philosophical detachment that bordered on dissociation, treating combat as an abstract exercise in technique rather than acknowledging the human reality of what they were doing. Others turned to alcohol, poetry, or religious practices that helped them cope with the contradiction between their idealized self-image and the brutal reality of their daily work. Within the samurai class itself, there were elaborate hierarchies that determined whose suffering mattered and whose could be ignored. Lower-ranking samurai were expendable in ways that their training hadn't prepared them to accept. Picture discovering that all your preparation for dying honorably was really preparation for dying conveniently, at the right moment, for the right political purpose, in a way that would enhance your lord's reputation rather than expressing your own spiritual development. The foot soldiers, ashigaru, who fought alongside samurai were treated with a kind of casual disregard that made clear just how little human life actually mattered when it conflicted with strategic objectives. These were men with families, dreams, and fears identical to those of the samurai they served, but their deaths were recorded as numbers rather than individual tragedies worthy of poetry or remembrance. Even among samurai themselves, rank determined everything. A lower-ranking warrior who showed exceptional skill and courage might be rewarded with slightly better equipment or a marginal increase in stipend, but he would never be allowed to forget his place in the hierarchy. Picture spending your life perfecting abilities that made you objectively superior to your social betters, only to be required to defer to their mediocrity because of accidents of birth that had nothing to do with merit or character. The periods between wars weren't peaceful interludes, but times of anxious preparation for the next outbreak of violence. Samurai lived with the knowledge that their skills were becoming obsolete even as they continued to perfect them. The introduction of firearms made traditional martial arts less relevant on actual battlefields, but the cultural investment in these techniques was too deep to abandon easily. Picture the psychological whiplash of transitioning from the heightened intensity of combat back to the mundane requirements of peacetime service. Your body and mind had adapted to the specific stresses of life or death situations, but now you were expected to find fulfillment in administrative duties, ceremonial functions, and the kind of political maneuvering that felt trivial after experiencing the clarity that came with fighting for your life. The wounds, both physical and psychological, accumulated over years of service. Imagine carrying scars from dozens of battles, joints that ached from old injuries, and a collection of memories that made sleep difficult and social interaction exhausting. The Warrior Code provided little guidance for dealing with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, offering only the suggestion that true warriors should be able to transcend such weaknesses through proper spiritual discipline. Veterans of multiple campaigns often found themselves isolated even from other samurai who hadn't shared their experiences. The specific knowledge of what humans looked like when cut open, the memory of particular sounds that dying people made, the way that extreme fear smelled, these weren't topics that could be discussed in polite company, leaving warriors alone with the psychological burden of their expertise. As we prepare to explore the final segment of samurai existence, imagine how these experiences of violence and political manipulation layered on top of the childhood conditioning and daily service pressures we've already examined. The romantic ideal of the warrior philosopher was being systematically destroyed by the reality of what that philosophy demanded in practice. The samurai ideal wasn't just demanding, it was logically impossible. Picture trying to live according to a code that simultaneously required absolute loyalty to your lord and absolute adherence to moral principles, when those two requirements regularly contradicted each other. Your lord might order you to do something that violated every ethical standard you've been taught to value, but refusing would mean abandoning the loyalty that was supposed to define your entire existence. The concept of Bushido itself was a moving target, changing based on political convenience and the personal preferences of whoever happened to be in power at any given moment. Imagine spending your life trying to embody an ideal that nobody could define consistently, where yesterday's virtue might become today's dangerous thinking, where the principles you'd been willing to die for could suddenly be reinterpreted as disloyalty to the current regime. The pressure to be simultaneously fierce and gentle, decisive and contemplative, absolutely obedient and morally independent created a kind of psychological paralysis that many samurai learned to hide behind elaborate displays of confidence. Picture the exhaustion of constantly evaluating every action, every word, every thought against multiple contradictory standards, never knowing which version of perfection you were supposed to be demonstrating at any given moment. The meditation practices that were supposed to provide clarity often only highlighted the fundamental contradictions in samurai existence. Sitting in silent contemplation, you couldn't avoid confronting the gap between what you were supposed to be and what your actual life required you to do. The peaceful mind that meditation was meant to cultivate seemed incompatible with the constant vigilance that survival demanded. By the Edo period, most samurai found themselves in the peculiar position of being professional warriors in a society that had largely eliminated warfare. The Tokugawa shogunate's success in creating domestic peace meant that the primary skills samurai had spent their lives developing were no longer needed, but the social structure that defined their identity remained unchanged. Picture the existential crisis of being a hereditary warrior in a world where actual fighting had become not just unnecessary but actively discouraged by the government. Your ancestors had died gloriously in battle, your training had prepared you for the same fate, But now you were expected to find fulfillment in administrative work, ceremonial duties, and the maintenance of traditions that increasingly felt like elaborate theater performed for an audience that was losing interest. The economic reality was even more demoralizing. Merchants, who ranked below samurai in the official social hierarchy, were becoming wealthy through trade while samurai struggled to maintain basic dignity on fixed stipends that bought less each year. Imagine watching people you were supposed to consider your social inferiors living in comfort that you couldn't afford, eating food that was beyond your budget, wearing clothes that your family's economic situation made impossible. Many samurai took on side work that technically violated their status. Teaching, crafts, even merchant activities conducted through intermediaries. But this created yet another layer of psychological stress. You were simultaneously required to maintain the appearance of noble warrior and secretly engage in the kind of practical economic activity that your class was supposed to disdain. The martial arts that samurai had perfected over generations became increasingly irrelevant in a world dominated by firearms and professional armies organized along modern lines. Picture spending decades mastering sword techniques that were beautiful, philosophically meaningful, and completely impractical for actual combat against enemies equipped with contemporary weapons. The poetry, calligraphy, and aesthetic sensibilities that had been integrated into samurai education remained culturally valuable, but they weren't enough to justify the economic cost of maintaining a hereditary warrior class. Imagine being someone whose expertise in classical literature and sword forms was genuinely impressive, but whose skills had no practical application in a world that needed engineers, administrators, and merchants more than it needed warriors. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and other refined pursuits that had been incorporated into samurai culture created their own psychological burden. Picture trying to find spiritual meaning in the precise placement of flowers when your family was struggling financially, when your social status was becoming increasingly meaningless, when the entire framework that had given your life structure was slowly dissolving around you. Even the physical training that had once prepared samurai for battlefield conditions became a form of elaborate exercise with no practical purpose. The calluses earned through endless sword practice, the flexibility developed through martial arts training, the pain tolerance built up over years of conditioning. All of this remained impressive but served no function beyond personal satisfaction and the maintenance of traditions that fewer people each year found relevant. The Meiji Restoration didn't just change the political system. It eliminated the entire social framework that had made samurai identity possible. Picture waking up one day to discover that the government had officially abolished your class, that carrying swords was now illegal, that the stipends your family had depended on for generations were being replaced with bonds that might or might not maintain their value. The speed of change was psychologically devastating. Within a few years, everything that had defined samurai existence, the clothes, the weapons, the social privileges, the economic arrangements, was swept away by a modernization program that had no patience for traditional ways of life that interfered with international competitiveness. Some samurai adapted by joining the new military or entering government service, but these options required abandoning most of what had made samurai culture distinctive. Picture having to choose between maintaining your traditional identity and ensuring your family's survival, knowing that choosing tradition meant condemning your children to poverty and social irrelevance. The rebellions that some samurai organized against the new order were simultaneously heroic and pathetic. Desperate attempts to restore a way of life that had already been made impossible by technological and social changes that no amount of sword skill could reverse. The courage these men showed in fighting hopeless battles against modern armies was real, but it was the courage of people who preferred death to adaptation. Perhaps the cruelest irony of samurai existence was that the very qualities that made someone an effective warrior, the ability to endure suffering, the willingness to die for abstract principles, the skill in violence, often made them less capable of finding happiness or meaning in ordinary life. The training that prepared them to face death gracefully left many of them unprepared to face life gracefully. Picture the psychological complexity of men who had spent decades preparing for a beautiful death, only to find themselves facing the prospect of an ordinary life. The meditation on impermanence that was supposed to create spiritual detachment often produced a kind of depression that made everyday pleasures seem hollow and meaningless. The relationships that samurai formed were shaped by the constant awareness that honor might require abandoning or even killing those they loved. This created a pattern of emotional distance that protected them from some of the pain of loss, but also prevented them from experiencing the kind of intimate connection that makes life emotionally sustainable for most people. Even success in samurai terms often felt like failure in human terms. Picture achieving the perfect warrior's mindset, calm in the face of death, unmoved by personal desire, capable of making decisions based purely on duty and honor, only to realize that these achievements had made you into someone who could no longer access the simple joys that made life worth living for ordinary people. The end of the samurai age was both a tragedy and a relief. Tragedy because it eliminated a cultural tradition that had produced genuine beauty, philosophical depth, and examples of extraordinary personal courage. Relief because it freed people from trying to live according to standards that were ultimately incompatible with human flourishing. As we prepare to close this long journey through the less celebrated aspects of samurai life, imagine the peculiar sadness of a way of life that demanded everything from its practitioners while promising them only the opportunity to lose everything gracefully. The romantic image that has survived in popular culture captures something real about the aesthetic and philosophical achievements of samurai culture, but it leaves out the grinding daily reality of trying to be human while meeting inhuman standards. And so we reach the end of our quiet walk through the shadows of samurai existence, having spent these peaceful hours exploring a way of life that knew very little peace indeed. As you lie there in whatever comfortable position you found, perhaps you can appreciate for a moment the extraordinary luxury of your current situation. The simple freedom to rest without constantly calculating the honor implications of your posture, to let your mind wander without analyzing every thought for signs of disloyalty or weakness. Think about the pillow beneath your head, how it cradles you without demanding anything in return, how it represents a kind of comfort that samurai were trained to view as dangerous softness. Your blanket doesn't require you to prove your worthiness to receive its warmth. The bed you're lying in doesn't judge whether you've earned the right to its support through demonstrations of courage or perfect adherence to an impossible moral code. The room around you, whether it's your own bedroom, a living room, or wherever you've chosen to listen to this long meditation on historical unhappiness, represents a sanctuary that exists purely for your comfort and convenience. No one is watching to see if your breathing demonstrates proper warrior spirit. No one is evaluating whether your relaxation shows sufficient readiness to die well if circumstances require it. You are free to simply be. Consider the beautiful ordinariness of your life compared to the lives we've been exploring together. You can choose what to eat based on what appeals to you rather than what maintains the proper appearance of your social class. You can speak to people based on genuine affection or interest rather than calculating the precise degree of respect that their rank demands. You can have friendships that exist purely for the pleasure of companionship, relationships that don't need to navigate the constant possibility that honor might require you to abandon or harm those you care about. Your mistakes, and we all make them, don't carry the weight of family shame that might persist for generations. Your bad days don't represent character flaws that could justify social exile or ritual suicide. Your moments of weakness, confusion, or simple human imperfection are just moments. They pass, they're forgotten. They become part of the normal texture of a life that's allowed to be imperfect without being shameful. The sleep you're drifting toward is uncomplicated sleep, not the vigilant rest of someone who might need to wake instantly ready for combat, not the anxious unconsciousness of someone whose dreams are filled with scenarios of potential failure and disgrace. Your sleep can be deep, restorative, and blissfully free from the weight of impossible expectations. Even your ability to listen to this story, to learn about historical experiences from a position of comfortable distance, represents a kind of freedom that samurai rarely enjoyed. You can contemplate their struggles without having to live them, appreciate their achievements without paying their costs, understand their world without being trapped within its constraints. As your breathing naturally slows and deepens, as your body settles more completely into whatever comfortable position you found, let yourself feel grateful for the ordinary miracle of a life that belongs to you rather than to abstract principles or social expectations that care nothing for your personal happiness. The very fact that you can prioritize rest, that you can choose comfort over readiness, that you can let your guard down completely, These represent luxuries that the warriors we've been studying could barely imagine. The samurai achieved extraordinary things. They created art, philosophy, and examples of personal discipline that continue to inspire admiration centuries after their world ended. But they paid prices for these achievements that few of us would willingly accept. Their dedication was real, their courage was genuine, their cultural contributions were significant, and their daily lives were shaped by forms of psychological pressure that would break most modern people within weeks. So as you drift towards sleep, secure in your comfortable, imperfect, wonderfully ordinary life, perhaps spare a moment of sympathy for those long-dead warriors who spent their lives trying to achieve an impossible perfection. They deserve our respect for their efforts and our gratitude for the reminder that the simple freedom to be human, flawed, comfortable, and at peace is one of history's most precious gifts. Let the weight of their struggles settle away from you like dust being gently brushed from an old book. Their story is finished, their burdens are lifted, and you are free to sleep as deeply and peacefully as your body desires, dreaming whatever dreams come naturally to a mind that belongs entirely to itself. Good night, and thank you for taking this long, gentle journey through history's less comfortable corners. Rest well in the knowledge that your life, whatever its challenges, offers freedoms that kings and warriors of the past would have envied. Sweet dreams.